Man, what's going on, everyone? Welcome back to the channel. Right now, this is a phone that I talk about so much only because this is pretty much the older brother of a daily driver phone that I had for a long time, a main phone. I hate saying daily driver, but I owned the LG G2 as a main phone for I would say like a year and a half, and this was like a phone that when this came out, I think I still owned the LG G2, and I was so like low-key so jealous of people who owned the G5 because that at the time was such a crazy revolutionary phone in my opinion at that time when I'm like a little kid. Well, I wasn't even that little, but like a couple years ago when I owned that, I'm like, man, that's what I aspire to get someday. And it's kind of funny looking at it now because easily like this phone is super cheap now, and a lot of ways it really hasn't held up the best compared to a lot of other phones. So right now we're going to take a look at it, see how it's held up, see what's going to look like in the future, all that other good stuff, man. But I'll tell you one thing, man, straight up from looking around the body, it doesn't look that bad, okay? It doesn't look that cheap. I mean, you have a pretty decent sized screen, 5.3 inches. It's 1440p. It is IPS, which that's probably the worst part about it. I wish it was OLED, but it's really not even that bad of a screen. And when you look at the back, you have a dual camera setup, so that's pretty interesting. You do have a removable battery and removable storage, all that good stuff. But the thing that really sucks the most about this is probably the build quality. And I just want to run into it right now because I'm probably going to spend a minute talking about it. It just doesn't feel like a premium phone. And granted, this thing was released in 2016. So, it wasn't really like what we have now, which like even the G6 felt pretty premium, much more premium than this thing. But this phone just doesn't feel like a $500 phone. It barely even feels like a $200 phone. And I think it not only does have a lot to do with the build, but I think it also has a lot to do with the removable battery aspect because they try to do this whole like modular thing with this. They try to make it so the removable battery was like from the bottom of the phone, and it was just so awkward. I've heard a lot of horror stories about it, and I don't know why LG ever did this. Weirdly enough, they took out the removable battery eventually, which is still kind of weird. So at least this thing had it, but they just really took a flop on this. I don't know why they ever did it like that. You had to like click a button and remove the whole bottom of the phone and then click it back. So you couldn't even use the phone unless you had like the other half of the phone. Or before, you could still use the phone if you lost the removable back or whatever, but if you lost the bottom part of this phone, that's over. And I think after a little bit of time of clicking back and forth, it kind of felt a little bit cheap, and the bottom of the phone of my specific unit did feel a little rocky. So just kind of keep in mind when you're looking forward, parts like that of these phones really don't hold up that well. So kind of keep that in mind when looking at these phones used, especially now, because I don't think a lot of people are going to buy this brand new. I don't even think they still sell them brand new. But I just want to take a quick second talking about that because that's a huge little issue that kind of affects me personally. Like I said, IPS panel on the front is really not that great, but it gets the job done. I wish it was OLED, like I said. The LG G6 actually had a pretty decent IPS panel. That one looked really, really good, but this one, not so much, I would say. Now, turning it on, we do have Android Oreo, which is pretty surprising. It was rumored not to get it, but eventually it did. For some reason, my unit is still not on Android Oreo, so I think some units got it and some units didn't. But from the last I heard, it did get Android Oreo at some point. But like I said, I think for some variants, I think for a lot of the carriers, it's kind of up to them to push the updates. Every time I go to the LG software update version, I just keep getting that it's up to date, but I don't think it is. So I'll keep kind of messing with it, but I guess it is what it is. Now, the cool thing about this phone is that there are quite a bit of custom ROMs out for this thing. You can root it and custom ROM it. But what I'll tell you is that there's only a certain amount of variants that are able to be custom ROMed and rooted. And if you're going to go about that route and try to root it and custom ROM it, make sure you read the fine print. I've seen so many people mess up their phones. Even me, dude. I messed up so many LG phones. My LG G2, I messed up so many times because I flashed the wrong ROM to it. Because if you're using an AT&T phone and you flash a Verizon ROM on it, you're going to mess up your phone completely. Now, sometimes you might get away with it, but like 9 times out of 10 you're going to mess up. So make sure you follow the fine print. I have seen some Android Oreo ROMs for this thing. I don't know if I've seen any Android Pie ROMs. I don't think so, but there's a little bit of original Android development out there. So go to XDA forums and go see what you can find. I would totally 100% recommend you custom ROM and root this phone, not only because it adds so many more features and everything like that, but you also get a more up-to-date version of Android, and this thing's not even supported anymore. So you might as well go and update to it while you can. So in terms of software and features, LG kind of puts their own UI over it. I am like such a not fan of this thing. I really don't like LG's UI. I think now it's kind of cleaned out a little bit. I actually used to like their UI when the LG G3 was out, even the LG G4, but then the G5 came out. I never really liked that UI, never got used to it. So in terms of software, this thing is very, very average, I would say. It's not going to like excel in any way. You're not going to be super surprised about it, but you do get some features in it, so that's kind of cool. Now moving on to the performance aspect of it, I'll just say the specs and I'll I'll kind of elaborate on them a little bit. This thing has a Qualcomm Snapdragon 820 processor, a quad-core CPU, an Adreno 530 GPU, and 4 gigs of RAM. And with those specs, you would probably think this thing could power to the moon and, surprise your parents and probably take you out on a date and all those things. But I'm telling you, like, the performance on this phone is surprisingly, like, average. I was expecting this phone, especially with the specs that it had. I was looking at it, I'm like, man, this phone looks pretty decent. And I don't know too much about GPU, so maybe the Adreno 530 isn't the best thing ever. But what I'll tell you is that the performance is very, very average, and I was expecting it to be more than that because, first of all, this phone was released in 2016, which isn't even that long ago. I mean, it was like 3 years ago, whatever. It's not like a crazy amount. I've seen, like, the iPhone 6s came out almost 4 years ago, and I still think that's pretty fast phone. And this one, I mean, it's fast for sure. It'll get you to point A to point B. I say that in every video. It'll get the job done, but it just depends, how glitchy it is and all these things. And I can tell you this phone is just a little bit glitchy. It's not crazy. If your like expectations are low, this will probably satisfy. But because I am someone who goes through and tests so many phones, I test more phones than probably the average person, I can tell you that there's a lot of phones out there that are probably around the same price point that are sometimes faster than this and has way less specs on paper. So whether you're multitasking or even just flipping through some pages, it just seems like LG's UI just bogs down the system memory so much that makes it seem so slow. And even though the specs on paper are very decent and respectable for the age of this phone, I think LG just did a really poor job at just kind of managing their UI and kind of making it use what it had. So, they say work what your mama gave you, whatever they did, whatever they said. It just seems like LG was not flaunting what their mama gave them in this opinion, in this scenario. That kind of goes with gaming too. I mean, casual games obviously 100% will work fine. I say that in every video, but casual games are going to work fine no matter what phone you use. Then when you get to the heavier intensive games, that's where it kind of starts getting a little iffy. With Real Racing 3, it seems okay sometimes, other times not so much. This phone does heat up quite a bit though, which is kind of a thing that I'll have to talk about in a second. It just seems more of like a hardware problem. It just doesn't really feel like it can handle the game. It does get noticeably hot, so kind of keep that in mind when using this phone. So that kind of covers up the performance aspect of it. I will probably rate it like a 6.5, maybe a 7 out of 10, and that's kind of on the lower end. That's a very like a light 7. It's not like it is a 7. It's probably like a 6.75, whatever that is. And that's considering the age of this phone, because this phone for a lot of people isn't even that old of a device in my opinion. Now moving on to the camera, this is pretty interesting because the LG G5 does have a dual camera setup. It has a 16 megapixel sensor on the back as well as an 8 megapixel sensor. So it has a dual camera setup like I said. The main sensor does have optical image stabilization, so that's cool. You can shoot 4K videos at up to 30 frames per second, so also that's very, very cool. And I like the camera setup overall. I mean, it takes pretty decent photos. I don't really have that much to add to it. I don't really think there's too much to complain about or anything like that. I mean, it gets the job done. Could it be better? Yes, it could be better, but I don't think the camera is bad. I think LG did a pretty decent job on cameras for their devices, even since like the G2 if I can remember. And I'll definitely say that the camera on this thing is one of the better parts. It does have an 8 megapixel sensor on the front camera as well, and I don't think the front camera is that bad either. You can shoot 1080p videos at up to 30 frames per second on it, so it's not even that bad of a front camera. It's definitely one of the best aspects of this phone, 100%. If I had to, I could definitely use it. I think there's a lot of features within LG's camera, so that's one cool thing that they have going for it. And just remember, if you flash a custom ROM on your phone, especially if it's an LG phone, all those features most likely will be taken out unless you flash like a stock ROM or like a firmware from another phone, whatever, then it'll work. But more often than not, if you flash a stock Android ROM on your LG G5 or LG whatever, most likely all those camera features will be taken out. So kind of keep that in mind. But in my opinion, the camera on this thing is fairly solid and I like it. Now the battery life is one of those things that does kind of suck a little bit, but it's also kind of good too, because look, first of all, I just want to say this thing does take USB Type-C, so that's cool. On stock, it has a 2,800 mAh battery, and because of the way this phone was manufactured, you can't really put an extendable battery in it per se, because you have to remove the bottom of the phone, and you can't really do that because the bottom of the phone makes up, and I think LG did that on purpose. But what you can do is like bring an extra battery with you and I guess swap out the batteries that way, so you can instantly bring your phone back up to 100%. But that's kind of like an old-fashioned route, so I mean, it is what it is. It's kind of good, it's kind of bad. I'll say on stock, the battery life isn't that great. I think it has a lot to do with the hardware of the phone, but also the screen. I mean, the screen is 1440p and it's not a horrible screen, but it is kind of high resolution. So I think in terms of that, the battery life will probably get you through a day, but on my usage, it could probably get me through like half a day, maybe. I use my phone a lot throughout the day. I don't use like heavy apps, but I have quite a bit of screen on time. So I'll definitely say that the battery life is probably one of the weirder aspects of it. Now, some other notable things to note, this thing does have a micro SD card slot, so that's super, super cool. It also has a fingerprint sensor on the back. So that's really interesting for those people who need a fingerprint sensor. You do have that capability stability on this phone. There's no IP certification, no water resistance that I can see, and this is probably the worst thing about this phone. This phone did suffer from quite a bit of boot looping, and I save it to the end because this has a lot to do with my final opinion about this phone. I said the same thing with the Nexus 5X, and I will probably say the same thing with most other LG phones in the same year category, whatever. I'm not going to say that about the newer LGs, but I'll definitely say that that is one aspect that, this phone could be the 100% best phone in the world. And if it has a noticeable amount of people complaining about one specific problem, chances are that problem is probably true, and it affects a lot more devices than what people are just saying. And I think that the boot looping issue that this phone had, it just really ruined the reputation of it. It could have been, like I said, the greatest phone in the world, but looking in the future, there's more and more chances of a device boot looping the longer it lives. And that same thing happened with my LG G2. It's starting to boot loop now. It actually boot looped like years ago, but it still boot loops now. It's so weird. And I feel like in the position that I'm at, if I recommended the LG G5 to people, it would just be kind of a rude thing for me, because I know a lot of people watch these videos and I could not sleep at night if I recommended the LG G5 because of the problems it has. So what I'll do is I won't recommend the LG G5 to pretty much anybody. If you have it now, I guess keep it. It's like a ticking time bomb, but I guess it works for you. What I'll tell you is you might as well go, instead of buying an LG G5, which you could probably find for like around $100, probably more so like $80 to $60, you're probably better off buying like an iPhone SE. I know that's kind of like apples and oranges. You're literally like you're getting an Android instead of an iOS, whatever. But I'll tell you that in terms of stability, the iPhone SE will do you much better in terms of the longevity, and you can probably find one in the used market on eBay or something for less than $100 for the base model. So I would probably recommend you to go there. If you want to spend a little bit more money, you can probably get like a Google Pixel. I've been recommending those like crazy, and a lot of people like those. A pretty stable phone, not many like hardware problems with that. So I'd probably recommend that phone. And there's so many other phones out there too, but those two are some ones that come straight to mind, and those are ones I've been recommending a lot more recently. So I'll leave links to both those in the description below. Make sure you get them from that link. I always try to find the lowest prices on Amazon and link them straight below. So every purchase that goes through those links actually helps out the channel too. So I'd really appreciate if you guys could do that. But that is pretty much it. If you guys have any questions or anything like that, leave it down in the comment section below. Hit that like button. That'll mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. Every single subscriber that we get really does count. So it'll mean so much if you guys could hit that. Also check out the other links down in the description as well. My Twitter, my Instagram, my second channel, all those links are linked down below. I would really appreciate if you guys could check it out. But more importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out, Dylan.